So a few days from now, we will be celebrating the holiday of Shavuot. We will be reciting Hallel, and I thought it would be a nice idea to spend a few moments talking about one of the Psalms, the second Psalm that we recite in Hallel. As we recite Hallel all the way through the year, we're singing the songs. It goes by a little bit quickly, and so we often don't really have time to look closely at the beautiful poems that we find in Hallel. I'd like to take a close look at Psalm 114, which you can see on the handout, first in English, and then on the third page of the handout, first in Hebrew, and then in English on the third page of the handout. It's also on page 316 of the Siddur if you don't happen to have the handout. It's a beautiful little poem. We know that a number of nice melodies for it. But as I say, we kind of go through it quickly, and we don't usually have much time to think about what this psalm is actually saying to us. That's what I'd like to do now. Let me first just read through it so that we all know what the contents are. You can follow along on the first page in Hebrew or on the third page in English. I'd like to read through it and translate and just notice a few oddities in the psalm that when we're going a little bit more slowly, we can begin to pay attention to. And then I'd like to think about what these oddities end up trying to say to us. B'tzeit Yisrael mimitzrayim, Beit Yaakov me'am lo'ez, Hayeta Yehuda l'kodsho, Yisrael mamshelotav. When Israel went forth from Egypt, the house of Jacob from people speaking a strange tongue, Judah became his Kodesh. I'll come back to what that might mean in a few minutes. But Judah became something. Literally, Judah became his holiness, Israel his dominion. Let me just point out a few things here. First of all, I think it's always important to ask the question, how does a poem begin? The first word of a poem is often very, very significant in terms of setting us up for understanding everything that will follow. And here, I'm going to be making the argument today that the first letter of the poem, the first element of the poem, the prefix Beth, which means when, that's the key to the whole psalm. That's the key to this entire poem. The key question that this poem wants us thinking about is when. What is the time frame that this poem is talking about? This poem that begins when Israel went forth from Egypt. The second line also can cause us to pause. Hayeta Yehuda l'kodsho. Israel became his holiness. That raises a whole lot of questions, one of which is only evident, though, in the Hebrew. The verb hayeta, what is a little bit odd about this verb, hayeta? It's a feminine verb. It's a third feminine singular suffix form. It's a feminine verb that matches a female subject. But what is the female subject of this verse? The subject of the verb hayeta, which means became, the subject is Judah, and Judah is a male name. So we can wonder, well, what's missing here? What is implied here that the text doesn't say outright? And here, let me just pause to remind you that poetry, very, very often poetry consists of language that is boiled down to its essentials. One of the differences between poetry and prose is often that poetry is very terse. It leaves things out because it wants the audience to figure out what is missing here. There's a very simple example of that actually in the first two lines of the poem. In the English, it's laid out as two lines. That couplet is laid out really as sort of one line with a pause, and then on the same line, the second line. When we read that couplet that begins the poem, the first couplet is, when Israel went forth from Egypt. The first line of the couplet is, when Israel went forth from Egypt. The second line of this couplet is, the house of Jacob from people who speak a strange language. What's missing in the second line of the couplet is the verb. We know to supply the verb from the first couplet, bitseit, when went forth. That applies to both lines of the couplet, and we know to supply it in the second line of the couplet. That's a simple example, but often in poetry, a word is missing that really causes us more confusion and really causes us to slow down. That's the case here with the verb hayita. What is the missing feminine subject? Judah is a male name. The tribe of Judah, Shevet Yehuda or Matei Yehuda, that's a male noun too. Both of the nouns that mean tribe are masculine nouns. Some possibilities might include Eretz Yehuda or Admat Yehuda, the land of Judah, the soil of Judah. Those at least are feminine nouns. Maybe Mamlechet Yehuda, the kingdom of Judah. But there's a word missing here, and in all likelihood, thinking about what's missing is going to be helpful to understanding what this poem is saying. So the something of Judah became his holiness. Israel became his dominion. Who's the his? Who is he? Well, I think from context, it's pretty clear that we're talking here about God, but it's interesting that God isn't mentioned specifically. We just have the word his referring to God. It's a little bit unusual to have a pronoun without a noun before it as the reference. Actually, that's true of the first line too. When Israel went forth from Egypt, it's an odd line because God is missing. A very, very frequent phrase in the Bible is Asher hotzeti me'eretz Mitzrayim. God speaks of the people whom I took out of the land of Egypt. The Decalogue begins with those words, I am the Lord your God, Asher hotzeti, who took you out of the land of Egypt. The Shema ends with those words, that God took us out. God is missing here, and instead, very unusually for the Bible, this verse talks about the Israelites going out without mentioning God. That's another thing that's sort of missing in the terse language here. God doesn't show up explicitly in these opening lines. One more issue is, what does it mean to say that God became his Kodesh? That Judah became God's Kodesh. God's holy thing. That's something else we'll want to think about. But let me go on and just finish going through the poem, and then I'll come back to these questions. So when Israel left Egypt, Israel became God's holy thing. Hayam ra'av hayanos, hayarden yisov le'achor, heharim rakedu cha'elim givaot kivnei tzon. The sea saw and fled. The Jordan River, turned around. The mountains danced like rams, the hills like sheep. And now the poet addresses, or when we're saying the poem, and when we'll sing this, actually tomorrow for Rosh Chodesh, but then again a few days from now on Shavuot, when we're singing this now, we address the sea and the river Jordan and the mountains, and we say, Malacha hayam kitanus, hayarden tisov le'achor, ha'arim tirkedu cha'elim, givaot kivnei tzon. What's with you, O sea, that you are fleeing? O Jordan River, that you're turning around? O mountains, that you're dancing like rams? Hills, that you're dancing like sheep? And then we give a piece of advice to all of those geological entities. Milifnei Adon chuli aretz, milifnei Eloah Yaakov, hahufechi hatzur agam mayim, challamish l'mayno mayim. Tremble or dance, the word chuli could be translated either way. Tremble in the presence of the Lord, O land, in the presence of the God of Jacob, the one who changes a rock into a pool of water, flint into a fountain of water, into a fount of water, or into flowing waters. By the way, you'll notice that last line kind of takes us back to the beginning of the poem. Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, one of the greatest of the medieval rabbinic commentators, points out that the beginning of the poem speaks of the splitting of the Red Sea. Hayam ra'av hayanos, the sea saw and fled. That's a reference to the splitting of the Red Sea when the Israelites left Egypt. When God split the sea, God made something wet dry. In the last line of the poem, God is making something dry wet. A rock in the desert is dry, and God changes the rock into a pool of water. It's just a nice little poetic reversal as we go from the beginning to the very end of the poem that Radak points out. It's also nice to notice that in biblical poetry, when we get these couplets that are parallel to each other, often the second line in a couplet will echo the first, but turn it up a notch. It'll get a bit more fancy using a rare word, or it'll say something a bit more specifically, or it will say something more intensively. And that's what's happening here. Changing a rock into a pool of water is a pretty cool trick. But in the desert, actually, they look similar. They both are shiny. You can see a rock in the desert with the sun on it and the sun sort of glaring off of it. And a pool of water also is flat and shiny. They actually look similar. And so maybe we might miss the miracle. But the next line turns it up a notch, as is so often the case for biblical poetry. No, in the next line, God turns not just a rock, but flint, one of the hardest rocks, one of the least wet, so to speak, least soft of rocks, into not just water, but a pool of water, flowing waters. Now, those look different. A rock, even with the sun shining on it, and a pool of water that is flowing, those actually look different. It's just a nice example of this tendency of biblical poetry, not just to say something again, but to say something a little bit more intensively. So let me come back to the beginning of the poem and come back to the question I asked before. What does when mean? What does be mean? What's the time frame of this poem? On the surface, we might rephrase that question. This poem is talking about events that are talked about earlier in the Bible. What part of the Bible, especially what part of the Torah, is this poem alluding back to? And on the surface, it'll seem that this poem is alluding back to the Exodus. It starts off saying, "B'tzeit Yisrael mimitzrayim," when Israel exited Egypt. So it's talking about the Exodus, about Yitziat Mitzrayim. And in that case, this poem is alluding back to some specific passages in the book of Exodus, in Sefer Shemot. Chapter 14, chapter 15 are the chapters that describe the Israelites leaving Egypt through the Red Sea that has been split on dry land. On the surface, it would seem that that's what we're alluding back to. But I'd like to suggest that something else is going on here. If you turn to the second page of the handout in Hebrew, or the last page of the handout in English, I'd like to read the first verse of Exodus chapter 19 from Parshat Yitro. Not Parshat Bishalach, the story of the Exodus, but Parshat Yitro, which is the story of the giving of the Torah, the story of Matan Torah, the story of the revelation at Mount Sinai. The story of revelation at Sinai begins with the following words, and I'm going to pronounce them in a certain way. In verse 1, I'm going to read verse 1 of chapter 19 out loud. Ba chodesh hashlishi letzeit b'nei Yisrael me eretz Mitzrayim. Vayom hazeh ba'u midbar Sinai. I hope that you heard from that funny way that I read it, and from the way that I've laid it out in the text here in bold, that the first verse of our psalm, of Psalm 114 from Hallel, is actually contained inside of the first verse of the story of the giving of the Ten Commandments. The giving of the Ten Commandments begins with this verse that says, "In the third month after the children of Israel left from the land of Egypt, on that day they arrived in the wilderness of Sinai." It's kind of a long verse that tells us exactly when the Israelites make it to Mount Sinai. What our poem does is it takes that long verse and it boils it down to its essentials. Our verse, the opening of Psalm 114, is simply really a translation of the prose of Exodus 19 into poetry, into terse language that just contains the essentials, just contains what's really, really important. Now, in other words, our psalm is alluding back to, is borrowing from Exodus chapter 19, not from the Torah's story of the Exodus from Egypt. It's actually alluding back to the Torah's story of the giving of the Torah, the Sipur Matan Torah, the story of revelation at Sinai. Whenever you see a poem that's alluding back to something, or a novel, or a short story, or a movie, once you notice an allusion, it's worth pausing and going back to the text that's being borrowed from to see if there are other connections, because in addition to the obvious connection, it will often turn out that the later text is putting in some other hints that take us back to the source text, and that's very much the case here. If you look a little bit further in Exodus 19, again at the material that I've put in bold, in verse 3, you'll see a reference to the house of Jacob, Beit Yaakov, which is the very next thing that we read in the first verse of our psalm. B'tzeit Yisrael Mitzrayim, Beit Yaakov me'am lo'ez. The house of Jacob, where did that word come from in the poem? It's coming from Exodus chapter 19, verse 3. It's coming from our source text. Go a little bit further, and we get some information about that odd phrase, Hayata Yehuda likodsho, Israel became God's holy thing. First of all, to say that Israel is God's holy thing, the word Kodesh can have a number of meanings in biblical Hebrew, but one of the things that the word Kodesh can mean is a particular object or thing that belongs specifically to God, that is God's personal property. The whole world belongs to God, but within the world, there are certain objects or things or places or people that God has a special relationship with. One way of saying that in terms of biblical law is such an object is called a Kodesh. Actually, even in rabbinic law, in the Talmud, there's a whole section of the Talmud called Kodshin that talks about God's specific property. Another word for that is Sigula. Sigula, which comes from an Akkadian, a Babylonian word that has a similar meaning. And that's a word that shows up in verse 5. In verse 5 of Exodus 19, we read that God says to us, "So now, if you obey me and if you observe my covenant, you will become my Sigula. You will become something that belongs to me and is precious to me." Kodesh in the Psalm is the same idea as Sigula back in Exodus. And when we go a line later to verse 6 of Exodus 19, we read, "You will become my Mamlechet Kohanim. You will become my kingdom of priests, and my Goy Kadosh, my holy people." The second line of the psalm entirely consists of a play based on these two lines in Exodus 19. When the psalm says, Hayta Yehuda likodsho, it means the same thing. Judah will become God's holy property. And now we know what's the actual subject of the word, of the verb hayata. What's that subject? It's the noun mamlachto, mamlechet kohanim. You will be a nation of priests. And I think we should understand the psalm as saying mamlechet Yehuda. The feminine subject that's left out of the poem that we've got to figure out is the word mamlechet. That is a feminine singular verb. That means kingdom. And so Yehuda in the poem is alluding back to mamlechet kohanim in Exodus 19. And then there's a second allusion to the word mamlechet kohanim in the next line of this couplet, the word memshalto, or mamshalotav. That word means dominion, which is a synonym of kingdom, and it actually has a lot of the same letters. Mamshalotav and mamlechet both begin with two mems, and then later there's a lamed and also a kaf. They're totally unrelated words. Etymologically, the one word has nothing to do with the other, but they do have similar meanings and they do have a similar sound. So mamlechet is showing up twice in the poem, never explicitly, but it's being hinted at. Yehuda is really a short way of saying mamlechet Yehuda. Judah is a short way of saying the kingdom of Judah. And mamshalotav, in case you didn't get the allusion, mamshalotav is another hint. The word dominion is reminding us of the word kingdom back in our verse from Exodus 19. In short, what I'm really suggesting here is an answer to my question, what does be mean? What is the temporal area that this poem that this poem at the beginning of Hallel is talking about? It's not just talking about the Exodus. More primarily, it's talking about the giving of the Torah. And when we go further in the poem and we read about the mountains skipping, the hills trembling, that also is a reference to the Exodus. I'm sorry, that is also a reference to the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, because we're told that there was an earthquake, that Mount Sinai was shaking. So the rest of the poem continues picking up on this. Even the idea of the pool that replaces the hard rock, that also is a reference to the time that the Israelites spent in the wilderness of Sinai, when God provided water for them in the desert for example, when Moses struck the rock and so forth. Why does all this matter? Why does a poem that on the surface seems to be talking about the Exodus, why does it actually talk about the giving of the Torah? To put it in holiday terms, why does a poem that we would tend especially to associate with Passover, with Pesach, why does it turn out on a deeper level, in fact, to be talking about Shavuot? I think a lot of us kind of think of Psalm 114 as an Exodus psalm. It starts off by talking about the Exodus. It uses the word tzeit, which is the same word from which we get the word Yitziat Mitzrayim. But when we look at it a little bit more slowly and carefully, we see that no, it's not just alluding to Exodus 14 and 15, to the story of Yitziat Mitzrayim, of the Exodus from Egypt. Much, much more, it's alluding to Exodus 19 and 20, to the story of the giving of the Ten Commandments. I think that this poem is doing something really quite important. Actually, let me just mention one other element here. When it says the sea saw and fled in the third verse, Hayam ra'av vayanos, what's missing there is the object. What did the sea see? What did the ocean visually witness? That's not stated there, but elsewhere in the Bible, it's generally the case that the scariest thing in the world to see is God's self-revelation. I give you a few examples. We don't have time to go through all of them. But for example, in Psalm 77, we get the phrase, Ra'u hamayim. The waters saw you, O God, and they fled. Actually, even in the story of the giving of the Ten Commandments, in chapter 20, the people move backwards because they're afraid at the vision of God that they see on top of Mount Sinai. So what the sea saw that made the sea flee, that made the sea split, was God's self-revelation at Mount Sinai. To which you might respond, wait, but the splitting of the sea happened in the first month of the year, in Nisan, when Passover happens, and Mount Sinai, God doesn't appear on Mount Sinai until the third month of the year, until Sivan, the time of the holiday of Shavuot. So the sea saw God's revelation in month number 3, and then 3 months earlier, 7 weeks earlier, it flees, it splits. I think that if you ask the author of the poem about that, the author of the poem would say, don't be so prosaic. The author of the poem is talking about deep connections among what seem on the surface to be different events. When you're telling a story in prose, you're interested in what happened when. That's what it means to tell a story. Storytelling, in a sense, is kind of counting. You're saying first this happened, then the second thing, then the third thing, then the fourth thing. Storytelling, narrative, is by definition a matter of counting. Actually, how do you say to count in Hebrew? Lispor or safar. How do you say to tell a story in Hebrew? Lisaper, siper. How do you say to count in German? Zahlen. How do you say to tell a story in German? Erzählen. It's the same word. Even in English, to count, to recount. Recount is another word for saying a story. Anybody know Hungarian? Neither do I. But giving this lecture in the past, people who do speak Hungarian tell me the same is true in Hungarian as well. Storytelling is a matter of counting. It's telling first this happened, then something, then something, then something. And the fact that that's the case not only in 4 different languages, but in 3 different language families, Semitic, Indo-European, we had 2 Indo-European examples, and Finno-Ugric, the family that Hungarian belongs to, that tells us, yeah, there's something about storytelling, about storytelling that is mathematical. Poetry, though, isn't mathematical. Poetry doesn't go from number 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, because poetry is always based on parallels of some kind. Every line of a poem is parallel to what came before it in one way or another. poetry is much more circular. As it goes forward, it's also going back. And I think that that's the difference between Exodus 19 and Psalm 114. Psalm 114 is telling us what exactly happened. I'm sorry, Exodus 15, 16, 17, 18, 19 is telling us what happened when. The Psalm wants to talk at a deeper level, not just about different events, but about what seem to be different events, but at their core are really the same event. By telling us that the sea saw what happened at Mount Sinai and therefore fled 3 months earlier at the time of Passover, what this poem is doing, what Psalm 114 is doing, is telling us that the Exodus and the Revelation are a single event. To put it in holiday terms, Passover and Shavuot are a single holiday. This poem is telling us that freedom by itself, that's just not a Jewish thing. Passover by itself, that's not a Jewish thing. Freedom from slavery that allows us to serve God, leaving Egypt so that we can get to Mount Sinai to receive the mitzvot, to receive the commandments that we're supposed to obey, that's a Jewish thing. Freedom is not a Jewish value. It's a really important thing for American Jews to understand. Freedom is not a Jewish value. Freedom for the sake of taking responsibility, that's a Jewish value. If you just have Exodus 14 and 15, but you don't have Exodus 19, from a Jewish point of view, you don't have anything. If you just have freedom and you think freedom matters, then you're not living a Jewish life. You're not thinking in a Jewish way. If you understand that the purpose of your freedom is to serve God, the purpose of freedom is to observe the mitzvot, then you're living a Jewish life. In a sense, this poem is telling us, you've got to understand Passover and Shavuot are the same holiday. And actually, we can go even a step further, going back to the poem itself, going back to the Psalm. The second half of verse 3, the second line of the couplet in verse 3, goes on to talk about the Jordan River splitting. Now, where does the Jordan River split in the Bible? When does the Jordan River split? It's Joshua chapter 3. It's when the Exodus and the wandering through the desert are done 40 years later, and the Israelites enter the land of Israel. The Israelites cross the Jordan, which echoes the sea, by splitting to let the 12 tribes, now led by Joshua, because it's 1 month after Moses' death, to let the 12 tribes led by Joshua enter the land of Israel. And so to Jews who have the privilege of living at the moment in Jewish history that we're living in, I think this poem is going even a step farther. It's saying that Passover and Shavuot and Yom HaAtzmaut, they're a single holiday. Gaining freedom, accepting responsibility, and then building a society in the land of Israel that deserves to be called a Mamlechet Kohanim and Goy Kadosh, that deserves to be something that can be called a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. That's the Jewish thing to do. So in a sense, I think this is actually really a very, very challenging poem that we kind of sing quickly at Hallel, but don't quite have time to think through. In a way, what this psalm is saying is, if you observed Passover, but you didn't observe Shavuot, you didn't observe Passover. If you observe Passover, for Jews of our era, but you didn't celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut, you didn't celebrate Israel's Independence Day, you never celebrated Passover. If you recited this poem in Hallel at your Seder, or at Shacharit during Passover, but you're not going to recite it 5 days from now on Shavuot, or you didn't recite it last month or earlier this month on Yom HaAtzmaut, if you recited Hallel on Passover, but not on Shavuot and not on Yom HaAtzmaut, you never observed Passover at all. What you were doing might have been a nice family gathering around dinner at your table, but if you've got Passover without Yom HaAtzmaut and without Shavuot, you don't have Passover at all. This is actually a very, very important poem. Moving through it slowly, I think, presents something of a challenge to a lot of American Jews, and it's important to realize what that challenge is. It's telling us that freedom is not a value for us. Freedom to take in order to take responsibility, that's a value. Passover is not a Jewish holiday. Passover that leads to Yom HaAtzmaut and to Shavuot, that's a Jewish holiday. And so I'd like to invite you all to actually observe Passover, to complete the observance of Passover a few days from now. This would be the perfect time for me to say, and so I hope to see you all 5 days from now. But I actually won't see you all 5 days from now. I will be back in Teaneck, back at my home congregation of Beth Shalom, and with my family for Shavuot. So this is actually a very good time just to say thank you to this whole community, to Rabbi Graber, to the staff of the synagogue, to my many fellow biblical scholars in this synagogue, and to the whole community for having been so warm to me during this year of my research leave. I'll be going back to New Jersey. I'll be going back to full-time teaching at JTS later this week, actually probably tomorrow or Monday, and it depends on how packing goes. But this is also a time to say, not only I very much hope that you complete your observance of Passover a few days from now, but to say thank you very much for being a very, very warm and welcoming community. Toda rabah, Shabbat Shalom, and Chag Sameach.